Hello and welcome along. So today we're going to talk about Xenos and the Imperium's relationship with Xenos during the Great Crusade, particularly the hostile relationships with aliens during the Great Crusade, and if any of those interactions could have realistically led to the destruction of the Imperium or the failure of the Great Crusade. In other words, was the Imperium's enormous fear and hatred of aliens really justified? And if it was, what was the closest point to the actual defeat by aliens? So the Imperium's relationship with aliens is really set up by the events of the Age of Strife. So before Terra was united under the Emperor, humanity had, of course, gone through Old Night, through the Age of Strife, this terrible time when they were assailed on all sides by all manner of terrible beings, many of which were aliens. And so the Imperium was built on this fear and hatred of aliens, which came about because they had been under attack by so many aliens before, and they feared this happening again. And indeed, when the Great Crusade started, in those very early stages of the Great Crusade, they often found human populations being dominated, enslaved by aliens. In fact, even within the solar system itself, there were aliens operating and dominating, enslaving humans. So this was kind of like the normal interaction between aliens and humans. So it was relatively well justified fear that the Imperium had that they might encounter an alien species that was too powerful and might destroy them. And so they tended to go into every meeting with aliens with an enormous amount of suspicion and were very quick to draw the bolter to begin the purging of said aliens. Now, not all of the interactions with aliens were hostile, or at least not in the beginning. The Imperium did have short-term negotiations, alliances, even with some aliens out of convenience, such as wanting something valuable from the aliens being seen as just a bit too powerful to make it necessary to seek them out and actually wipe them out like the Eldar, or where lower level authorities within the Imperium found it more convenient to negotiate or trade with aliens and things like this without really getting the top tier permission directly from the throne world. There are also incidents during the Great Crusade where Primarchs actually negotiated with aliens. They didn't immediately attack them and wipe them out. So it wasn't that you had to instantly annihilate any alien you saw. Horus himself, just before being wounded with the Athenaeum and eventually falling to chaos, was in negotiations, discussions with the Interrex, who were a human civilization, quite advanced technologically human civilization, who had aliens amongst them. Those aliens, although it raised suspicion with Horus and those with him, it didn't cause them to instantly attack and wipe them out. So the relationship was a bit cloudy. The actual guidelines of what the Imperium would or should do when it finds aliens during the Great Crusade wasn't that black and white. However, it did usually result in violence. And of course, the Interrex eventually were destroyed by the Imperium. The Diaspora, another human civilization that had aliens within its civilization, were also wiped out by the Imperium. And generally speaking, there was a lot of purging the Xeno during the Great Crusade. So when aliens fought back or actually started conflict, because they often did, it was usually contained to one world or a system or maybe a few close nearby systems. And so they were never really a great threat to the Imperium. Yes, there might be very hard battles. Many people might die, but the Imperium was so vast, it usually just fell back on its enormous resources of manpower and warships, etc., to just keep pummeling them until they were destroyed. And they were never really an existential threat. They were never really likely to stall the Great Crusade properly or threaten Terra itself. But there were a few exceptions. So the Imperium had this great fear of aliens, and one of the great fears it had was infiltration. It had this constant fear of being manipulated, controlled, dominated through secret methods, so mind control, basically, because during the Age of Strife, again, a species known as the Enslavers had controlled vast quantities of humans across the galaxy and had caused an enormous amount of suffering to humans by using their mind control, as well as many psychers who were particularly prevalent during the Age of Strife, who were usually corrupted by the warp and also often dominated and controlled human societies with their psychic powers. So there was this great suspicion against manipulation about being controlled. And the Imperium did find several species during the Great Crusade who did use this mind control methods. And species such as the Nephilim were particularly hated by the Imperium. They controlled people and they used their slaves as food, basically by sucking the energy out of them through adulation, so worship. So if people worship them, that fed them. As part of their way of living, they would gather as many worshippers as possible together to feed them, and they would have control over these people. They became their thralls, essentially. They were nothing but meat puppets to these aliens, and they used them up like they were nothing to them, which caused a particular high level of hatred amongst the Imperium for these aliens because of the way they treated humanity. And various other mindless alien species tried this method of controlling humans, and often did it successfully. Infiltrated worlds, took over, controlled higher level officials and things like this, used them to their advantage. But eventually the Imperium would find them, root them out, and eventually overthrow them and destroy them. Sometimes, well, in fact, quite often, these aliens would pop up again here and there in the galaxy. So it was quite difficult to wipe them out completely, but at various times, various mind-controlling aliens did infiltrate parts of the Imperium, but they never really came close to completely dominating the Imperium or even stalling the Great Crusade. It was just a blip in the progress of humanity back out into the galaxy. Now, of course, there were some real major threats out there who could have potentially stalled the Great Crusade, but didn't really do so. People like the Eldar. The Eldar were out there. They are, of course, highly technologically advanced and powerful psychers. Could have been a great threat to the Imperium if they were more united and more driven to defeat the Imperium, but they just weren't. And so they kind of had quite a back seat during the Great Crusade. They just kind of got out the way of the Imperium wherever they could. And the Imperium kind of ignored them as long as they didn't get in their way. A mutual standoff of like, well, we don't really want to get into it too hard with these people because they're quite dangerous. We don't really trust them, but we don't hate them enough to hunt them to the ends of the galaxy and eliminate them. But if they really get in our way, we'll kill them. If that kind of went both ways. The Eldar didn't really pose a existential threat to the Imperium during the Great Crusade. Other species that are famous in the present day of the 40k universe, like the Tyranids, Necrons, Tau, these just didn't exist in the 30k universe during the Great Crusade. Well, the Necrons did exist, but they were asleep. No, there was no great threat. Well, okay, the Tyranids existed, but they were out in a long way away, out in the void in between galaxies. And the Tau probably existed in some primitive Stone Age sense, but they didn't exist as threats to the Imperium in any way. And so, well, who did? I'm going to propose there were 3 alien species that genuinely posed a threat to the Imperium and could have stopped, perhaps even reversed the Great Crusade. So, in no particular order, these are the Hrud. So the Hrud are probably the least well-known out of the species I'm going to mention, but they're relatively well-known. The Hrud did exist in relatively large numbers during the Great Crusade, and they required the Iron Warriors to mount a very large campaign against them, which eventually resulted in their destruction of their homeworld and a supposed genocide. However, the Hrud keep coming back throughout the history of the Imperium, so they weren't actually wiped out. And part of what the Hrud are is that they always seem to come back. You can't really wipe out the Hrud. It's very hard to eliminate them. It's very hard to find them in the first place, but when you do find them, it's very hard to kill them. It's very hard to eliminate them properly. They always pop back up somewhere else. And they have an ability to rapidly expand their population and launch these massive migrations out of nowhere, which can catch the Imperium off guard and lead to enormous casualties amongst the civilian population of the Imperium. And then when military action is taken to try and stop these migrations, the Imperium suffer enormous casualties. And during the Great Crusade, they did suffer many defeats by the Hrud, particularly their ability to cause this aging field around them that degrades everything that comes into proximity with them. Rapidly aging equipment and people makes it very hard to deal with them. And even Astartes had great difficulty in fighting Hrud. And so although they wiped out many of them, they can be killed and were in large numbers and vast numbers. They also caused enormous damage to the Imperium. And their main real threat to the Imperium, the reason they stand out above these other minor threats, not because they won a few engagements or that they killed Astartes from time to time, because many aliens did that. It's because their ability to launch these enormous migrations out of nowhere, which, if it happened at the right time in the right place with large enough numbers, could have been a major threat to the Great Crusade. It could have completely knocked the Great Crusade off of course, and perhaps even threatened terror. These migrations are not truly understood by the Imperium, so don't really know why they happen, what prompts them to happen, or what prompts their direction and things like this. But so it's perfectly possible one could have just popped out of nowhere, not that far from Terra, and a massive swarm of Hrud just pour into the Sol system, and everybody's dead before you can react. That could have happened in the Great Crusade. It didn't, but it could have. So the Hrud were genuine threats to the Imperium, and I suppose continue to be a genuine existential threat to this day, should they have a large enough migration in the right spot. The Rangdan of the Rangdan Xenocides fame. So these are a species that I've talked about in the past in some of my previous videos. We don't know a huge amount of them specifically, but we know what they did. We know that they caused enormous damage to the Imperium. They required massive campaigns against them to try and eliminate them. And it's believed that they were eliminated by the end of those Xenocides. Although, again, like all aliens, they pop back up from time to time, or at least hints of them do. So perhaps they do still exist somewhere out there. But at the time, they were an enormous threat to the Imperium and genuinely came close to derailing the Great Crusade, requiring enormous resources to try and defeat them and eventually to seemingly defeat them, which resulted in enormous casualties to the Dark Angels, the Space Wolves, the Death Guard. Many other legions took enormous damage and potentially led to the downfall of the Lost Primarchs, required the intervention of the Emperor himself, and so must be accepted as a genuine threat to the Imperium. Had a few engagements gone slightly different direction, it could be possible that they could have gone on the offensive and started driving back into the Imperial controlled space. And then who knows where the Great Crusade goes. The next step would have had to have been gathering the other legions to converge on them and combine the Imperium's entire military might against them to wipe them out. And perhaps that would have happened, probably would have. But if it had required that much, that means all of the various other parts of the galaxy that those forces were operating in are now vulnerable to uprisings, counterattacks, etc., from the various aliens that were in those areas. And of course, not to mention rebel humans that pop up all over the place throughout the Great Crusade. So humans within the Great Crusade are always trying to rebel against the Imperium. And given a chance like that, many would have certainly taken their chance. So it's very possible that the Rangdan were close to stalling the Great Crusade and close to causing the eventual destruction of the Imperium. And finally, last but not least, the ever-present orcs. So orcs have always been a problem for humanity. They're everywhere, and they never go away. The Imperium has fought the orcs on uncountable occasions. It's defeated the orcs on uncountable occasions. It's been defeated by the orcs on uncountable occasions. Probably more resources of the Imperium were put into fighting orcs across its existence of its time, the 10,000 years of its existence, than probably any other species. And during the Great Crusade, the orcs were a major threat. Now, the orcs have always been disorganized and fractured, which has stopped them from taking over the Imperium. And of course, they did nearly destroy the Imperium after the Great Crusade during the Wars of the Beast, when they were more united and more coordinated, which made them incredibly dangerous. But during the Great Crusade, there were still some very large orc empires that had enormous effects on the Imperium and required massive resources to be devoted to defeating them. And of course, the campaign that seemingly finalized the Great Crusade before the Emperor went back to Terra was Ulanor, which was against a massive orc empire, the greatest that they'd had experienced up to this point. And it was believed at the time that this was the end of the threat that the orcs presented, because this orc empire was so vast and so powerful that surely it was the last threat, that once we've defeated this is it, we've broken them. But of course, the orcs always come back. So the orcs genuinely did present a major threat to the Imperium during the Great Crusade, which required enormous resources being devoted to defeating them. And they never really went away. They were always just popping back up. You can never turn your back on a planet that had orcs on. It just always keeps spawning orcs. And of course, they're not just on planets. They're in the rock. They're all the asteroids. Any space hulk that's floating about, it's probably infested with orcs. And as soon as orcs get onto your planet, it could be a beautiful, pristine planet. Once there's just a few orcs on there, you're probably never going to fully get rid of them. Even if you defeat them completely militarily, they're just there. Their spores are in the air. There's always going to be a problem. So in many ways, the orcs represent the greatest alien threat to humanity during the Great Crusade, because they're just so persistent and they just keep coming back. And of course, one of the great talents of orcs is building things, useful things, out of shit. They take all sorts of manner of crap, turn it into something dangerous, often dangerous to them, but also dangerous to other people. And so it doesn't even matter if you just completely obliterate their civilization, they'll just build a new one out of it. So ironically, although the Imperium's big fear is always infiltration and mind control and psychers and the domination of humans as slaves, really their greatest threat during the Great Crusade from Xenos was from the orcs, who are essentially a more exaggerated form of the Imperium, just extremely violent, aggressive, constantly infighting, as don't so much want to enslave humanity or control it, or certainly don't want to manipulate humanity in any way, just want to fight and destroy anything they come across. And so, in fact, they were the brutal, direct threat, rather than the indirect, shadowy threat that the Imperium was always looking for, which presented the Imperium's most likely chance of defeat or failure of the Great Crusade. So, yeah, I know I said in no particular order, but during the description of the orcs, it occurred to me that, no, they definitely were the number one threat to the Imperium during the Great Crusade. If only the orcs had been slightly more organized and slightly more coordinated, they could have derailed the Great Crusade and potentially wiped out humanity, which they almost did, of course, later during the War of the Beast. So yes, humanity's fear of aliens, hatred of aliens is probably justified, even though there are some good aliens out there. You don't actually have to always purge the alien, but sometimes it is best to be on the safe side. So let me know what you think. Is there any major aliens I missed out? Remember, we are talking about during the Great Crusade period. Obviously, I appreciate it. There are different threats now in the current universe, and perhaps the orcs no longer present the greatest Xeno threat. But I think that it's fair to say they were during the Great Crusade. As always, it's great to hear your comments. Please like, subscribe, and share, and I will see you next time.